The year was 1811, and London stood at a crossroads between grandeur and uncertainty. The lamps burned faintly along its narrow streets, carriages rattled over uneven stones, and the air carried both the weight of war and the glitter of society. Behind the walls of palaces and ballrooms, music and laughter poured forth, yet just across the Channel, Napoleon's armies thundered across Europe, and Britain's very survival was at stake. This was the beginning of the Regency, a chapter unlike any other in England's long history. The word itself revealed its cause. King George III, who had reigned for half a century, could no longer govern. His mind, clouded by illness, left him unable to fulfill the duties of a monarch. In his place stepped his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, to rule as Prince Regent. For nearly a decade he would stand in his father's stead, holding authority without a crown, shaping a nation caught between old certainties and a rapidly changing world. It was a compromise born not from triumph but necessity. Yet from that necessity sprang a period remembered less for laws and battles than for style, elegance, and contradictions. The Regency era unfolded as a study in contrasts. Britain was locked in a desperate struggle with Napoleon, pouring men and money into campaigns that stretched across the continent. At the same time, society at home seemed to dance away the tension. In London, Bath, and Brighton, the fashionable elite staged endless assemblies, masquerades, and dinners, while poets and novelists poured out works that would last for centuries. One half of the nation marched to war. The other half polished its silver and practiced its steps for the next ball. At the center of it all stood the Prince Regent. He was larger than life, adored for his taste, and mocked for his extravagance. He commissioned sweeping boulevards in London, transformed the seafront of Brighton with his exotic pavilion, and surrounded himself with artists, architects, and tastemakers. He loved pleasure, and in pursuing it, gave the age its defining look. He was no great statesman, and yet his fascination with fashion and art left behind a legacy still visible in the very stones of England's cities. Critics saw vanity, admirers saw refinement. History has preserved both. But the Regency was never simply about the prince. It was also about those who lived in his orbit, the generals who carried Britain to victory at Waterloo, the writers like Jane Austen who exposed the subtleties of love and manners in an age bound by rules, and the radicals who demanded reform in the face of poverty and repression. It was a society in motion, an England caught between the weight of tradition and the pull of modernity. Its contradictions made it fragile, but they also made it unforgettable. To step into the Regency is to step into paradox. It was a moment of triumph over Napoleon and of despair among the unemployed soldiers who returned home to no work. It was an age of literature that captured eternal truths about love and class, even as debtors' prisons filled and children toiled in factories. It was a time when beauty and hardship stood side by side, when glittering chandeliers lit rooms that echoed with whispers of unrest. Perhaps that is why this short decade continues to hold such fascination. It was not a revolution in the way France or America knew revolutions, but a quieter turning of the wheel, shaping tastes, ideas, and expectations. The Regency did not last long, but in its brevity, it carved out a place in memory. Its fashions, its buildings, its stories endure, and through them, we glimpse a society both refined and restless. This is where the tale begins, with a king too ill to rule, a prince too eager to shine, and a nation suspended between danger abroad and change at home. It is a story of contrasts, of surfaces and depths, of style masking struggle. And like any compelling story, it beckons us to follow further, to walk through its ballrooms and battlefields alike, and to understand why such a short chapter left such a lasting mark on the history of England. Stay with this journey, for the Regency era, though brief, remains one of the most dazzling pages ever turned in the English past. If the Regency began with a king too ill to govern and a prince eager to dazzle, its true character unfolded not only in politics or war, but in the life of its cities. For to understand the age, one must step beyond the throne rooms and battlefields and walk the streets where society gathered, where fashion and ambition met, and where the very rhythm of England could be heard in the clatter of wheels and the strains of music. It was in London, Bath, and Brighton that the Regency spirit found its stage, settings where elegance shone most brightly, even as the shadows of hardship pressed close. London in the Regency years was not merely a city, it was a stage upon which the ambitions and anxieties of an entire nation played out. By day, its avenues swelled with traffic, carriages rolling past markets, merchants calling out their wares, apprentices and clerks weaving through the crowds. By night, the capital transformed into a theater of brilliance, where chandeliers lit the ballrooms of Mayfair, and music drifted out across the cobbled streets. London was the heart of English society, where politics, culture, and fashion met in a constant rhythm of movement and display. At the center of this transformation stood the West End. Newly laid boulevards and terraces reflected a hunger for grandeur, as if the city itself sought to declare its rising power. Architects like John Nash reimagined London with sweeping colonnades and elegant facades, turning Regent Street and Regent's Park into showcases of refinement. Behind these facades, gilded drawing rooms hosted conversations as carefully measured as the attire of their occupants. For the wealthy and the titled, London was both home and stage, a place to see and to be seen. Beyond London, Bath remained a jewel of polite society. Long associated with its mineral springs, the city had evolved into a place where appearance was as vital as health. Its crescents and terraces, built in the Palladian style, offered graceful backdrops for promenades and social encounters. Visitors gathered at the pump room, not only to partake of the waters, but to cultivate reputations and forge connections. In Bath, the rituals of conversation, introduction, and dance carried as much weight as any remedy. Further south, Brighton rose from a modest seaside town into a fashionable retreat. Its transformation owed much to the Prince Regent, whose fantastical royal pavilion, with domes and minarets evoking distant lands, captured the imagination of the nation. Brighton became synonymous with leisure, a place to breathe the sea air, try one's fortune at gaming tables, and dance through the night in glittering assembly rooms. It embodied the Regency spirit in its boldest form, extravagant, theatrical, and irresistibly modern. Together, these three centers, London, Bath, and Brighton, formed a triangle of elegance. London provided the political and cultural core, Bath reflected tradition with classical harmony, and Brighton offered novelty and escape. Each drew its own circles of influence, but all shared a common pursuit: to project refinement in a society increasingly attuned to appearances. Success for the elite was measured not only in land and wealth, but in one's presence on these fashionable stages. The architecture mirrored these ambitions. Villas in Palladian symmetry and townhouses in neoclassical form reflected a fascination with antiquity, as if England wished to anchor itself to the grandeur of Greece and Rome. Columns and pediments adorned new structures, while interiors glowed with chandeliers, mirrors, and silks. Music played as guests measured their steps, each movement choreographed to reflect dignity and status. The very buildings seemed designed for performance, carrying within their walls the aspirations of a nation. The aristocracy lived by rituals of display. Balls, masquerades, and assemblies were not mere diversions, but vital arenas for securing alliances, cementing reputations, and planning futures. A glance across the dance floor could shape destinies. A hand of cards could alter fortunes. Life among the privileged moved in cycles of entertainment and duty, where each evening offered another opportunity to affirm one's place in the social order. Yet beyond these dazzling circles, another world pressed close. The same London that glittered with light in Mayfair also contained districts where conditions were far harsher. Industrial change was reshaping the city, drawing thousands into crowded neighborhoods where smoke and noise defined daily life. Workshops and factories created new opportunities, but also new struggles, binding many to long hours of labor with little relief. For those outside the world of chandeliers and gilded salons, the promise of refinement felt distant. The contrast was striking. On one side, gowns swept across polished floors, orchestras played into the early hours, and glasses of champagne sparkled under candlelight. On the other, men and women returned home weary from their work, seeking rest before the cycle began again. The same era that produced grand crescents and exotic pavilions also produced crowded tenements and restless discontent. The Regency was an age of brilliance, but its brilliance was sharpened by the shadows around it. This tension gave the period its unique character. It was an age that celebrated elegance with unmatched enthusiasm, even as inequality and hardship marked much of everyday life. The Prince Regent himself embodied this duality, patron of architecture and the arts, yet often indifferent to the struggles of those beyond his circle. To look at the Regency is to see both the polished surface and the reality beneath, both the grace of society and the strain it concealed. And perhaps it is precisely this contrast that makes the Regency unforgettable. The beauty of London's terraces, Bath's crescents, and Brighton's pavilion dazzles all the more when remembered against the backdrop of industrial smoke and crowded streets. The music of the ballroom gains poignancy when set against the din of labor. The period was defined not only by what it displayed, but also by what it chose to overlook. The atmosphere of the Regency was thus one of light and shade interwoven. It promised beauty, refinement, and escape, yet bore the weight of social division and industrial change. In this interplay of elegance and reality lay the true spirit of the age. Its cities, its architecture, its rituals, all glittered brightly, but their light could never entirely hide the struggles beneath. The story of the Regency is found in this very contrast, and it is here, in the tension between splendor and strain, that the essence of the era reveals itself. Amidst this landscape of glittering cities, grand crescents, and crowded streets, no figure loomed larger than the man who lent his name to the age. The Regency was not only reflected in the architecture of London or the rituals of Bath and Brighton, it was also embodied in the personality of the Prince Regent himself. To understand the splendor and the strain of the era, one must look closely at George, his ambitions, his tastes, and the contradictions that made him both the symbol and the paradox of his time. George, the Prince Regent, was a man whose personality seemed to embody the very contradictions of his age. To the public, he was dazzling and frustrating in equal measure, a figure of immense charm and taste, yet one whose appetite for pleasure often overshadowed his duties. He cultivated an image of refinement, the best clothes, the grandest houses, the finest paintings, the most elaborate entertainments. Few could deny his eye for beauty or his instinct for spectacle. Yet behind the brilliance lay a reputation for extravagance, for debts that grew as rapidly as his architectural projects, and for indulgence that seemed to distance him from the struggles of his people. His relationship with his father, King George III, was strained almost from the beginning. The king, known for his discipline and moral rigor, regarded his eldest son with disapproval. Where the father sought duty and restraint, the son sought pleasure and display. The divide widened as George III's illness deepened. When the king's mind faltered, the prince took on the mantle of regent, not with the satisfaction of a long-awaited triumph, but under the shadow of necessity. It was a transfer of authority steeped in family tension, a son ruling in the place of a father who was still very much alive, though absent from the stage of governance. The Prince Regent was not, however, a man of politics in the traditional sense. His strengths lay not in policy or debate, but in taste, charm, and the ability to surround himself with capable advisors. His court sparkled with artists, musicians, and designers. But when it came to matters of government, he relied heavily on ministers to steer the ship of state. Spencer Perceval, his first prime minister during the Regency, carried much of the weight of war and finance, guiding Britain through turbulent waters until his sudden death in 1812. The shock of that event left the regent reliant upon a new figure, Lord Liverpool, whose long tenure provided stability even as the nation grappled with war abroad and unrest at home. In this arrangement, the Prince Regent found a kind of freedom. Shielded by his ministers from the most difficult decisions, he could indulge his passion for architecture, patronage, and ceremony. He envisioned cities transformed by broad streets and elegant squares, palaces that shimmered with exotic inspiration, and interiors that reflected a harmony of color and design. These were not trivial pursuits. They shaped the very face of London and Brighton, leaving monuments that endure as symbols of the Regency style. His influence was not in laws passed or battles won, but in the cultural and aesthetic character of his time. Yet his detachment from political affairs also invited criticism. Many saw him as out of touch, preoccupied with luxury, while the nation endured sacrifice. War with Napoleon demanded immense resources, taxes rose, markets strained, and ordinary people bore the weight of shortages and hardship. Against this backdrop, the Regent's entertainments seemed extravagant, even callous. The same public who admired his taste for beauty often whispered their disapproval of his distance from reality. Still, the Prince Regent had a gift for leaving impressions. His love of fashion set standards across Europe. His patronage of artists encouraged brilliance, and his passion for architecture gave the age its distinctive visual identity. His personality, with all its contradictions, became inseparable from the Regency itself. Elegant, yet indulgent, visionary yet flawed, inspiring yet controversial. In his court, one could see the essence of the period distilled. It was a world of spectacle and sophistication, of conversation flowing as smoothly as the wine, of music and laughter carrying into the early hours. But beneath the glitter ran undercurrents of tension, between father and son, between monarch and ministers, between a ruler's personal desires and a nation's urgent needs. The Regency era bore his stamp, not only in the streets and palaces he built, but in the very character of its contradictions. And so, in the figure of George as Prince Regent, one finds the paradox of the entire age, a leader admired for style more than substance, remembered for what he created in stone and silk rather than what he decreed in council. His reign as regent was not one of sweeping reforms or decisive victories, but of cultural flourish and political compromise. In him, the story of the Regency came alive, a reminder that history is shaped as much by taste and personality as by policy and war. Yet George's reign as regent cannot be understood through taste and temperament alone. Behind the glitter of his court and the elegance of his architectural dreams loomed a struggle that dwarfed all else. A war that consumed the wealth of the nation, dictated its politics, and touched the lives of every subject. While the Prince Regent surrounded himself with artists and advisors, Britain itself was locked in a desperate contest with Napoleon, and it was this conflict that would define the destiny of his age. The Regency years were lived in the shadow of a single towering struggle, the war with Napoleon. For decades, Britain had stood almost alone in Europe as the French emperor extended his reach across the continent, building alliances and breaking kingdoms with an ambition that seemed without limit. By 1811, when the Prince Regent assumed authority, the war was already long and wearing, a conflict that tested not only the courage of soldiers, but the endurance of a nation. Britain was fighting not merely for territory, but for its survival and its place in the order of Europe. The war was fought on many fronts. On the seas, the Royal Navy kept France and her allies at bay, ensuring that Britain's shores remained secure and its trade routes open. On the Iberian Peninsula, British troops under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, fought a grinding campaign alongside Spanish and Portuguese forces. These battles were slow, costly in effort and resource, but they forged the reputation of Wellington as a commander of patience and resolve. His army learned to stand firm against the relentless assaults of Napoleon's marshals, to retreat in good order when needed, and to advance with precision when the opportunity came. As the conflict wore on, the pressure at home grew heavier. War demanded money, and money came from taxation. Bread prices soared, trade faltered, and the people of Britain bore the strain of shortages and high costs. The Corn Laws of 1815, intended to protect domestic agriculture, only deepened the discontent, pushing the price of grain even higher. Riots and protests flared, not only in London, but across the industrial towns that were beginning to define Britain's new economic landscape. While ballrooms glittered, workshops and markets trembled under the weight of war's demands. Yet the war also bound Britain's people together in a shared sense of destiny. Newspapers carried reports from the front, celebrating victories and mourning setbacks. Songs and poems were written in praise of Wellington's steadfastness. Even those far removed from the battlefield felt the war's presence in their daily lives, whether in the form of higher taxes, shortages at the market, or the sight of soldiers marching through the streets. The struggle with Napoleon was not an abstract contest of kings. It was a reality woven into the fabric of everyday existence. It all came to a climax in 1815 at the fields of Waterloo. Napoleon, having escaped exile on Elba, returned to France and rallied an army with astonishing speed. Europe braced itself for another campaign, and at last, the fate of the continent was to be decided in a single encounter. Wellington, leading British and Allied forces, faced Napoleon in a battle that tested every skill he had honed in years of campaigning. The fight was long and uncertain, with attacks pressed and repelled, ground gained and lost. But Wellington held firm, coordinating his troops with the calm discipline that defined his leadership. In the evening, the arrival of Prussian forces under Blücher tipped the balance. Napoleon was defeated, his power broken once and for all. The victory at Waterloo was more than a military triumph. It reshaped Europe, ending a quarter-century of upheaval and cementing Britain's role as the continent's dominant power. The Prince Regent, though not present on the battlefield, basked in the reflected glory of his generals. Wellington returned home a national hero, celebrated not only for his skill, but for embodying the qualities of endurance and steadiness that the British liked to see in themselves. The name Waterloo entered the national memory, a shorthand for courage rewarded and danger overcome. For Britain, however, the cost of victory was immense. Years of war had drained the treasury, left industry strained, and imposed heavy burdens on every household. The soldiers who returned home often faced poverty, their service honored, but their prospects uncertain. The economy struggled to adjust from war to peace, and unrest simmered beneath the surface. Yet despite these difficulties, Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars with a new identity. Not merely as an island kingdom resisting invasion, but as a global power, mistress of the seas and arbiter of European balance. This transformation was perhaps the most enduring legacy of the war. In defeating Napoleon, Britain secured not only its own safety, but its dominance over trade routes that spanned the globe. The Royal Navy, tested and proven, stood unrivaled. British goods flowed outward to markets in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, carried in ships protected by the Union Jack. The sacrifices of the war years had been heavy, but they laid the foundation for an empire whose reach would extend far beyond Europe. In the years that followed, the Regency Era bore the marks of this victory. Its architecture, literature, and even its fashion carried echoes of triumph and stability hard won. Behind the elegance of the drawing rooms and the brilliance of the assemblies lay the memory of Waterloo, a reminder that the nation's splendor had been secured at great cost. The Prince Regent could preside over balls and ceremonies with confidence, knowing that his country stood not on the brink of conquest, but at the dawn of unprecedented power. Thus, the Regency's war with Napoleon was not merely a backdrop, but the crucible that defined the age. It was the struggle that shaped the politics, strained the economy, and elevated Britain to a position it had never before occupied. From hardship and conflict emerged both exhaustion and pride, both unrest and triumph. And in that complex legacy, one sees the very essence of the Regency itself, an era of elegance forged in the fire of challenge, and a nation stepping onto the stage of the world with newfound authority. Yet triumph on the battlefield did not mean peace at home. When the cheers for Wellington faded and the flags of victory were folded away, Britain confronted a harsher truth. War had ended, but its burdens remained. The soldiers who returned from foreign campaigns, the families who bore the cost of high taxes, the workers pressed by soaring bread prices, all now faced a different kind of struggle. The Regency's brilliance, so dazzling in its triumph abroad, was shadowed by unrest within. When the drums of Waterloo faded and the threat of Napoleon was finally extinguished, Britain stepped into a new reality. Victory had been glorious, but peace revealed wounds of another kind: economic, social, and political. Soldiers returned home in great numbers, men who had carried the weight of campaigns across Spain and Belgium, only to find that their homeland had little to offer them in return. Factories and farms were already crowded with workers, and the economy, strained by years of war, could not absorb them all. The sight of veterans in tattered uniforms searching for work became a familiar one, and with it came resentment. These men had given their strength to defend their nation, yet now they struggled to feed their families. The hardship was magnified by decisions made at the highest levels. In 1815, Parliament passed the Corn Laws, intended to protect English agriculture by keeping grain prices high. Landowners, many of them members of the aristocracy, saw this as a safeguard for their wealth. But for ordinary families, it meant bread became dearer at a time when wages were falling and opportunities scarce. Hunger was not confined to the poor. Even the middle classes felt the strain. Riots and protests flared across towns and cities, fueled by anger at a system that seemed to protect the privileged while neglecting the needs of the many. London itself was tense with this energy. While society in Mayfair danced beneath chandeliers, the voices of discontent carried from the working districts. In Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, centers of the industrial north, meetings were held calling for reform, for fairer representation in Parliament, and for relief from crushing prices. The Industrial Revolution had created new populations of workers in these towns, but their influence in politics was almost non-existent. Rotten boroughs with few voters still held parliamentary seats, while vast industrial cities had none. The imbalance was glaring, and in the wake of war, it could no longer be ignored. These grievances gave rise to a growing reform movement. Radicals and reformers, writers and speakers traveled across the country, urging people to demand change. They called for universal suffrage, for the right of ordinary men to vote, for a voice in the laws that govern them. Pamphlets circulated, meetings grew larger, and the government grew anxious. To the ruling class, reform carried the shadow of revolution. The French Revolution was still fresh in memory, and many feared that Britain might tumble into chaos if demands went too far. The Prince Regent himself, suspicious of reformers, leaned on his ministers to keep a firm hand. It was in this atmosphere that the events of August 1819 unfolded in Manchester. A peaceful demonstration was planned in St. Peter's Field, where tens of thousands gathered to hear speakers call for parliamentary reform. Families came with banners, men and women assembled in orderly ranks, determined to show that their demands were lawful and reasonable. Yet the authorities, fearing insurrection, sent in troops to disperse the crowd. Panic erupted, and in the confusion, people were trampled and struck down. What had been meant as a peaceful petition turned into a national tragedy, remembered as the Waterloo Massacre. The reaction was swift and bitter. Reformers denounced the government for using force against unarmed citizens. Conservatives defended the need for order. Newspapers carried the story across the kingdom, and the name Peterloo, a grim echo of Waterloo, became a rallying cry for those demanding justice. For the Prince Regent, it was a moment of profound unpopularity. To many, he seemed a symbol of a government deaf to suffering, indulgent in luxury while ordinary people endured hardship. His reputation, already tarnished by excess, now bore the stain of indifference to the cries of his subjects. The years after Peterloo saw repression as well as persistence. The government tightened laws against public meetings, censored radical writings, and strengthened its hold on the press. Yet the desire for reform did not disappear. If anything, the sacrifice of those in St. Peter's Field gave the movement a new sense of purpose. Leaders spoke of rights denied and promises broken, and ordinary people, though cowed, carried the memory of that day with them. Reform would not come immediately, but the pressure it created would echo through the next decades, eventually reshaping British politics. In this way, the Society of Regency Britain revealed itself as a study in contrasts. Triumph abroad gave way to turmoil at home. The splendor of the regent's court stood against the hunger of the laborer's table. A nation that had defeated Napoleon now struggled to reconcile its own divisions, and in those divisions lay the seeds of future change. The Regency Era, so often remembered for its elegance, cannot be understood without this other story, the story of discontent, of voices rising for representation, of moments when the dance floor and the marketplace seemed worlds apart. The unrest of these years, culminating in Peterloo, was not the end of a movement, but its beginning. It was the moment when Britain, fresh from victory abroad, discovered that its greatest battles might yet be fought within. Out of this turmoil, the deeper structure of English society came sharply into focus. The protests, the demands for reform, and the divisions that flared after Waterloo were not merely passing storms. They were reflections of a nation built on layers of privilege and struggle. To understand why voices rose in anger, one must look at how society itself was arranged: the nobility who held vast estates, the aspiring middle ranks gaining influence, and the laboring majority whose lives revealed the starkest contrasts of all. In the Regency years, English society revealed itself as a finely layered structure, a pyramid of privilege and struggle, where every rung of the ladder told a different story. At the top stood the nobility, those great families whose names carried centuries of history and whose estates stretched across counties. Dukes, earls, and marquises presided over country houses with countless rooms, their walls adorned with portraits, and their grounds shaped into vast landscapes by famous gardeners. In London, their mansions in Mayfair and St. James hosted glittering receptions where politics and fashion met beneath chandeliers. For these men and women, life was measured not in necessities, but in influence, parliamentary seats, advantageous marriages, and the wealth of land that provided them with a steady income. Just beneath them, the gentry and the upper bourgeoisie formed a class that thrived on refinement and aspiration. They were not crowned with titles, yet they sought recognition through education, manners, and service. It was within these circles that the naval officer, the barrister, and the merchant rose to prominence. The Napoleonic Wars had created heroes at sea, officers whose courage in battle elevated them into respectability, and in some cases, fortune. Lawyers and bankers prospered from the expanding needs of commerce, and merchants stretched their reach across oceans, bringing goods from India, the Caribbean, and beyond. This class, smaller than the aristocracy yet steadily growing, provided the energy and ambition that pushed Britain into new avenues of wealth. They built elegant townhouses in Bath, Brighton, and the growing suburbs of London, seeking to mirror the taste of the aristocracy while cultivating their own culture of respectability. They dined well, dressed fashionably, and invested heavily in education for their children. It was among them that the values of thrift, discipline, and advancement began to define what would later be called the Victorian middle class. In the Regency, their influence was still emerging, but their presence was unmistakable. They were the bridge between grandeur and labor, the proof that fortune could be made by talent as much as by birth. Beneath these layers, however, the picture was starkly different. The majority of England's people lived in conditions far removed from the drawing rooms of Mayfair or the crescents of Bath. In rural villages, farmers and laborers worked the fields with little reward, their lives dictated by harvest and rents. They were bound by the rhythm of the seasons, and while some enjoyed the security of steady tenancy, many lived precariously, one bad crop away from hunger. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to alter this rural order, drawing people into the cities. But for those who stayed, life remained a daily negotiation with the soil and the landlord. In the towns and industrial centers, a new kind of population grew. Men and women crowded into workshops and factories, working long hours for modest pay. Their lives were measured in shifts and wages, in markets that rose and fell with grain prices, and in lodgings often cramped and uncertain. They were the unseen foundation of the Regency world, those who produced the goods and performed the labor that made aristocratic balls and middle-class dinners possible. The gap between their lives and those of the privileged was immense, visible in every street where a mansion stood not far from a crowded alley. This contrast was one of the defining features of the age. The Regency dazzled with elegance, but beneath the sparkle lay the reality of imbalance. A handful lived in luxury, a growing number sought respectability through commerce and profession, and the majority endured a life of hardship with few prospects for change. Each group inhabited the same nation, yet their worlds rarely intersected except through the lines of service and dependency. The butler in the grand house, the sailor aboard a merchant ship, the farmer tilling a Landlord's soil, these were the threads that stitched the classes together, even as they underscored the distance between them. And yet, this very structure gave the Regency its unique energy. The nobility lent grandeur, the rising middle class supplied ambition, and the laboring poor provided the strength upon which the whole edifice stood. Their coexistence was uneasy, marked by tension and contrast, but it was also the engine that propelled Britain forward. To walk through London during these years was to see these layers vividly displayed. Carriages rolling past narrow courts, gentlemen in tailored coats crossing paths with apprentices in plain clothes, great houses rising above the bustle of markets. It was a society both united and divided, a world of brilliance and burden, sharing the same streets, the same nation, the same destiny. Amid these layers of wealth and want, one group's position revealed both the refinement and the restraints of the age. Women. If the Regency world was built upon class and privilege, it was also governed by rules of gender, where appearances and conduct carried as much weight as birth or fortune. To see how society truly functioned, one must look to the drawing rooms and ballrooms, where women moved within ceremonies of expectation and possibility, their futures often decided as carefully as the fortunes of great estates. In the Regency world, the position of women was defined by ceremony, expectation, and constraint. Every gesture in polite society seemed to carry meaning, every glance weighed against unspoken rules. A young woman's worth was often measured less by her talents or her mind than by her ability to embody the ideals of grace, modesty, and charm. The drawing room and the ballroom were not merely places of leisure, they were stages upon which futures were decided. Marriage was the ultimate goal, and the glittering assemblies of London and Bath served as what many called the marriage market, where alliances were formed with as much calculation as affection. In these gatherings, the rituals were exact. A dance card filled with the right names, a bow or curtsy delivered at the perfect moment could mean the difference between security and uncertainty. Families presented their daughters with care, mindful that a favorable match might elevate the entire household. Courtship was less a matter of romance than of negotiation, a delicate balance of reputation, fortune, and lineage. A misplaced word, a misstep on the dance floor, or a whisper of scandal could close doors as quickly as they opened. In such a world, appearances were both shield and weapon, shaping the destinies of women who moved through these carefully orchestrated spaces. Yet behind the elegance lay the narrowness of opportunity. For many women of the gentry and middle classes, life was confined to the domestic sphere. Once married, their world became the household, managing servants, raising children, overseeing the rhythms of family life. Ambition was circumscribed, creativity often channeled into embroidery, music, or painting. Education, though increasingly valued, was designed less to broaden the mind than to prepare a daughter for her role as wife and hostess. The household was her kingdom, but it was a kingdom bound by walls. Even so, women were not without influence. In the drawing rooms of society, their wit could shape opinion, their connections could steer marriages, and their presence could lend prestige to salons and gatherings. The subtle power of conversation, charm, and reputation was real, though it seldom translated into formal authority. Women were expected to uphold the moral fabric of society, to embody virtue, and in doing so, they became silent arbiters of respectability. Their influence was felt everywhere, even if it was rarely acknowledged in law or politics. It was through literature, however, that women of the Regency began to find a voice that could not be ignored. Jane Austen, writing quietly in the parlor of her family home, turned the rituals of courtship and inheritance into novels of sharp observation and enduring wit. Her works, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, revealed the social machinery of her age with clarity and humor, exposing both its charm and its absurdity. She gave her heroines intelligence, resilience, and a moral center, and in doing so, she offered readers a glimpse of female agency within a world that sought to limit it. Mary Shelley, a generation younger, would break boundaries even more dramatically. At only 18, she conceived Frankenstein, a novel born of imagination and philosophical debate, infused with questions about science, morality, and creation itself. Though very different from Austen's finely crafted comedies of manners, Shelley's work demonstrated that women could speak not only of romance and society, but of the deepest dilemmas of human existence. Her voice, like Austen's, became part of the intellectual current of the time, challenging assumptions about women's roles in art and thought. Together, these women signaled a shift. While the ballrooms still dictated marriages and the drawing rooms confined much of daily life, the written word allowed women to step beyond those walls. In print, they could critique, imagine, and create worlds of their own. The irony was striking. In an age that limited their public presence, some of the most enduring voices of the Regency belonged to women whose words outlasted kings and princes. Thus, the role of women in the Regency era was a paradox. Outwardly, they moved within strict boundaries. Daughters to be presented, wives to be secured, hostesses to be admired. Inwardly, and through their pens, they began to question, to shape, and to redefine the very society that constrained them. Their influence was subtle but profound, woven into conversation, culture, and literature. And while they lived in an age that prized elegance and restraint, they also planted the seeds of change, leaving a legacy that would grow far beyond the glitter of their ballrooms. And yet, the world in which women moved was not defined by domestic walls or the pages of novels alone. It was also shaped by the constant rhythm of ritual and ceremony that governed Regency society. From glittering ballrooms to quiet tea tables, from country festivals to the excitement of the racecourse, life itself became a performance, every gesture and gathering reinforcing the codes by which rank and respectability were measured. The Regency era was, above all else, a society of ritual and display. Its calendar was punctuated not only by battles and politics, but by balls, assemblies, tea gatherings, and seasonal festivals, each event carefully choreographed to uphold the rhythm of polite life. For the upper classes, these occasions were more than diversions. They were essential theaters of reputation, opportunities to affirm one's place within the intricate hierarchy of rank and refinement. Foremost among these occasions were the grand balls. To step into a ballroom during the Regency was to enter a world of candlelight, music, and measured ceremony. The floor shone with polished wood, chandeliers cast a warm glow, and an orchestra played the familiar strains of country dances and waltzes. Young men and women arranged their dance cards with anticipation, each step a negotiation not only of rhythm but of social standing. A hand offered, a dance accepted, a conversation shared in the pauses between figures, all carried significance. The dance floor was at once a place of pleasure and of diplomacy, where marriages were anticipated, alliances formed, and reputations carefully displayed. If balls were the grand spectacles of the night, the tea table was the intimate theater of the day. Afternoon tea served in drawing rooms across London, Bath, and Brighton was no casual refreshment, but a social ritual layered with meaning. The quality of the china, the elegance of the silver service, the refinement of the conversation, all reflected the household's cultivation. To pour tea with poise, to engage in light yet witty dialogue, was to demonstrate the essence of respectability. Here friendships were strengthened, impressions made, and the subtle art of influence practiced beneath a veneer of leisure. Seasonal festivals carried their own weight of tradition. The summer months brought garden parties and open-air assemblies, where music mingled with the scent of flowers and laughter filled the lawns. Autumn hunts and harvest celebrations reinforced ties between landowners and their tenants, blending ancient customs with the social expectations of the present. These events reflected not only continuity with the past, but the desire of the Regency elite to frame their lives within cycles of ritual and heritage, lending a sense of permanence to an age that was, in truth, rapidly changing. Among the most celebrated of pastimes was the race course. Horse racing during the Regency was more than sport. It was a national passion. Newmarket, Ascot, and Epsom Downs drew crowds from every tier of society. For the aristocracy, race days were another stage upon which to parade fine carriages, fashionable dress, and the sheen of wealth. Bets were placed, fortunes risked, and the thrill of competition added drama to the spectacle. Yet even here, beneath the grandeur of hats and silks, the rigid codes of decorum prevailed. To be seen in the right company, to offer the right gesture of approval, was as important as the race itself. Underlying all of these gatherings was the strict discipline of manners. The Regency elite lived within a world where every detail, from posture to tone of voice, from the cut of a coat to the length of a curtsy, carried meaning. To falter in etiquette was to risk exclusion. Letters of introduction carefully penned smoothed the way to new acquaintances. Rules of precedence determined who entered a room first, who spoke to whom, and in what order. Even leisure required discipline, for to be truly fashionable was to master not only style, but conduct. This devotion to propriety was not merely vanity. It was a system of order, a way of marking the boundaries of class and reinforcing the distinctions upon which society rested. Elegance and restraint became the language of authority, and through the observance of ritual, the upper classes affirmed their right to lead. For those outside the circle, the rituals could seem arcane, even inaccessible, but within the drawing rooms and assembly halls of the Regency, they were the threads that bound the social fabric together. Thus, the cultural life of the Regency was a tapestry of ceremony. Balls, teas, festivals, and races were not distractions from reality, but expressions of a society determined to codify its values in gesture and spectacle. They gave shape to an age remembered for its polish, its charm, and its unwavering attention to detail. In these rituals, the Regency revealed itself, a world of grace and performance, of refinement and restraint, where the act of living was itself a carefully composed display. In the world of the Regency, few legacies shone as brightly as its architecture and artistic vision. If society was measured by its rituals and politics by its wars, then the spirit of the age was carved into stone and plaster, etched into sweeping avenues and domed pavilions. Nowhere was this spirit embodied more fully than in the work of John Nash, the architect whose name became synonymous with the Regency style. Through his vision, London and Brighton were transformed into living monuments of elegance, spectacle, and ambition. Nash understood that architecture was not simply about utility, it was a language, a form of storytelling that conveyed power, taste, and aspiration. When the Prince Regent entrusted him with reimagining parts of the capital, Nash responded with a grand design that reshaped the face of London. Regent Street, curving with a theatrical grace, was more than a thoroughfare. It was a procession route, a boulevard that carried the weight of royal symbolism and urban modernity. Linking the heart of the city with Regent's Park, it offered a new vision of order and beauty, an axis along which the prince's presence was imprinted on the very fabric of the metropolis. Regent's Park itself was a marvel of planning. Enclosed by elegant terraces, each crowned with columns and classical motifs, it became a showcase of balance and proportion. The park was not only a green retreat, but a stage for architecture, a place where the nobility could promenade among designs that echoed the grandeur of Greece and Rome. Its crescents and villas suggested both refinement and aspiration, an ordered harmony that seemed to promise stability in an era of turbulence. Nash's genius lay in his ability to fuse landscape with architecture, to create spaces that were not merely inhabited, but performed. Nowhere, however, did Nash's imagination take flight more extravagantly than at Brighton. The Royal Pavilion, built for the Prince Regent as a seaside retreat, stood as a vision that startled and enchanted in equal measure. Domes rose like crescents of ivory against the sky. Minarets pierced the horizon, and interiors glowed with gilt and silk. Here, the influence of the East mingled with European classicism, producing a fantasy that seemed to step outside of England altogether. To some, it was indulgent excess. To others, it was the boldest statement of a new aesthetic, a willingness to look beyond the island and draw inspiration from distant worlds. The pavilion was less a palace than a dream rendered in stone, its exoticism both criticized and adored, but never forgotten. This interplay of classical restraint and oriental fantasy defined the Regency style. On the one hand, there was the measured admiration of antiquity, the straight lines, the pediments, the Doric and Ionic columns that spoke of Greece and Rome. On the other, there was the fascination with distant lands, their patterns, colors, and ornamentation. Together, they produced a style that was distinctly Regency, neither wholly ancient nor wholly foreign, but a fusion that reflected the curiosity and contradictions of the age. These architectural achievements were more than decoration. They expressed the values and anxieties of a society in transition. To walk down Regent Street or stroll through the gardens of Brighton Pavilion was to participate in the Prince Regent's vision of himself and his nation. They were symbols of stability after war, of sophistication amid unrest, of grandeur in the face of hardship. Nash's buildings reassured and dazzled, offering an image of order at a time when society was fractured, and a vision of indulgence in a world marked by restraint. The influence of this architectural language reached far beyond the elite. Builders and designers across Britain adopted Regency motifs, bringing stuccoed facades, iron balconies, and symmetrical terraces into towns and suburbs. Even modest homes echoed the style, their curved fan lights and simple moldings hinting at the grandeur of Nash's creations. In this way, the Regency aesthetic spread across classes, reshaping not only the capital but the country at large. Art and architecture together made the Regency one of the most visually distinctive chapters of English history. Its streets and palaces reflected both continuity and change, linking the authority of antiquity with the allure of the exotic. They revealed a nation eager to define itself not only through politics and war, but through beauty and spectacle. And in this pursuit, the age left behind a legacy still visible in the stones of London, the terraces of Bath, and the fantastical domes of Brighton. Thus, the Regency was more than a moment of social refinement. It was a performance written in architecture, directed by Nash, and staged by the Prince Regent. In its facades and pavilions, one reads the ambition of an era determined to dazzle, to project power and taste, to transform the everyday act of walking a street into a passage through history itself. Fashion in the Regency era was more than fabric and thread. It was a declaration of identity, a performance of elegance, and a reflection of the shifting values of a society poised between tradition and modernity. Nowhere was this more evident than in the carefully composed wardrobes of both men and women, where each garment carried meaning, and where appearance was elevated into an art. For men, the transformation of style was striking. The flamboyant silks and embroidered coats of the previous century gave way to a look that was at once tailored, severe, and refined. The tailcoat became the centerpiece of masculine attire, cut close to the body, tapering at the waist, with long pointed tails that lent an air of dignity. Paired with this were snug breeches or trousers, fitted closely to the leg and often tucked into polished boots, that emphasized both posture and discipline. Crisp linen shirts with high collars framed the face, while the cravat, tied in intricate knots, added a flourish that allowed personal expression within the boundaries of restraint. Above it all rose the top hat, tall and imposing, a symbol of urban modernity that crowned the Regency gentleman as he strode along the promenades of London or Brighton. The most influential figure in defining this new masculine elegance was George Beau Brummel. Neither noble nor wealthy, Brummel became the arbiter of men's fashion through his unerring taste and impeccable sense of style. He rejected ornament for simplicity, extravagance for precision. His creed was cleanliness, polish, and perfect tailoring. Brummel spent hours perfecting the knot of his cravat, selecting coats cut to the finest line, and ensuring that his boots gleamed with a mirror-like shine. Through him, dandyism was born, a philosophy of style in which discipline, subtlety, and refinement mattered more than gold braid or jewels. The Prince Regent himself, captivated by Brummel's poise, elevated him to the center of courtly fashion. Though Brummel would later fall from grace, his influence endured, shaping the very idea of modern male dress. For women, fashion underwent a revolution of its own. Gone were the heavy brocades and wide panniers of the Georgian court. In their place came gowns of airy muslin and silk, cut in the high-waisted empire style that flowed straight from beneath the bust, creating a column of grace and simplicity. These dresses, often in soft pastels or white, evoked the statuary of ancient Greece, reflecting the era's fascination with classical antiquity. The fabrics were light, allowing the natural form of the body to emerge without the rigid stays and hoops of earlier times. Shawls imported from India added warmth and exotic flair, while delicate slippers replaced the sturdy shoes of previous generations. The effect was one of youthful freshness and natural beauty. Hairstyles, once piled high and powdered, now softened into curls framing the face, often adorned with ribbons, feathers, or simple ornaments. Bonnets became an essential accessory, protecting fair complexions while offering a canvas for decoration. Gloves were indispensable. No woman of fashion would appear in public without them. The ensemble conveyed purity and delicacy, but also suggested a subtle liberation, as the lighter garments allowed greater ease of movement and a less encumbered silhouette. These shifts in fashion mirrored the values of the age. The classical lines of women's gowns reflected ideals of harmony and restraint, while the precise tailoring of men's attire symbolized discipline and order. Together, they expressed a society striving for balance between indulgence and decorum, between display and control. In every ballroom, the harmony of pale dresses and dark coats created a living tableau, a visual poetry that reinforced the hierarchy of manners and taste. Yet fashion was never static. Beneath the elegance of muslin gowns and polished boots lay the realities of industry and empire. Cotton from India, dyes from the colonies, and silk from abroad fed the appetite of Regency wardrobes. Fashion was global even before the word existed, and the very fabrics that draped the aristocracy connected Britain to distant lands. The pursuit of style was not only personal, it was also political, a reminder of the reach of British trade and influence. The rituals of dress reinforced social divisions. To appear in the latest cut or fabric was to declare one's place among the fashionable elite. To fall behind was to risk exclusion. For the poor, fashion remained an aspiration glimpsed in the streets or imitated in modest ways, while for the wealthy, it was a daily performance of superiority. The Regency world was acutely conscious of appearances, and clothing was its most immediate language. Beau Brummel himself once declared that a well-dressed man should attract no notice at all, so perfect was the harmony of his attire. In this paradox lay the essence of Regency fashion, the pursuit of an ideal so carefully constructed that it seemed effortless. For women, the ideal was grace without ostentation, beauty without artifice. For men, it was refinement without excess, discipline without dullness. Together, they created an aesthetic that would influence generations, setting the foundation for the Victorian age and beyond. Thus, the fashion of the Regency era was not a mere detail of history, but a chapter in its own right. It expressed the age's values of elegance, restraint, and spectacle. It embodied the contradictions of a society that celebrated freedom of expression while enforcing strict codes of behavior. And in its silhouettes, fabrics, and accessories, it left an image that still defines how we imagine the Regency today. Gentlemen in tailcoats and top hats, ladies in flowing gowns of pastel silk, and, at the heart of it all, the dandy's creed of precision and poise, forever associated with Beau Brummel. Art in the Regency era carried the same spirit of elegance, transformation, and contrast that defined the age itself. If fashion and architecture shaped how society appeared on the outside, painting and portraiture revealed how the age wished to be remembered. It was a period when artists did not simply reproduce likeness or landscape, but sought to capture mood, movement, and meaning. An era where romanticism began to dominate the canvas, offering visions of beauty, power, and change. At the center of Regency portraiture stood Sir Thomas Lawrence, the unrivaled painter of the elite. His portraits of kings, queens, and generals were not mere likenesses, but theatrical compositions, filled with vitality and presence. Lawrence possessed the gift of imbuing his sitters with grandeur, making them appear larger than life, yet without losing the spark of individuality. His brush captured the nobility of the Prince Regent, the authority of statesmen, and the allure of society's most celebrated figures. To look upon one of his portraits was to encounter not only a face but a performance, a distillation of personality into color and form. Through Lawrence, the Regency elite fashioned themselves as timeless, bathed in a light of power and sophistication. Yet portraiture was only one expression of the Regency eye. Beyond the ballrooms and drawing rooms, painters like J.M.W. Turner sought inspiration in the vastness of nature. Turner's canvases pulsed with energy, his skies filled with storms, sunsets, and blinding light. Ships tossed on turbulent seas, ancient ruins glowed in fading daylight, and mists obscured horizons with an almost spiritual intensity. His art was not about order or decorum, but about the sublime, the overwhelming sense of nature's power, its ability to both uplift and humble humanity. In Turner's works, one glimpsed the tension of the age, a nation proud of its mastery of industry and empire, yet confronted by forces far greater than itself. In contrast, John Constable turned his gaze to the quiet countryside. Where Turner sought grandeur and drama, Constable found poetry in the familiar. His scenes of Suffolk meadows, village churches, and winding rivers conveyed a reverence for the English landscape. The play of clouds across the sky, the sparkle of light on water, the presence of workers in fields, all spoke to a vision of harmony between people and land. Constable's art was rooted in memory and affection, a reminder of continuity at a time when industrial smoke and urban growth were beginning to alter the very face of England. His paintings were less spectacles than meditations, a quiet celebration of home amid upheaval. Together, Turner and Constable defined the romantic landscape in English art. They represented two poles of romantic vision, one dynamic and tempestuous, the other tender and reflective. Between them, they expressed the anxieties and hopes of a society in flux. Turner's fiery seas mirrored the uncertainty of a nation at war and in change, while Constable's serene fields offered comfort and constancy. Their works were not escapes from reality, but reflections of it, transformed into beauty on canvas. Romanticism in Regency art was more than an aesthetic. It was a philosophy. It sought to capture the emotional truths behind appearances, to elevate feeling above calculation, to reveal the human connection to the natural and the eternal. Painters no longer strove merely for precision, but for atmosphere, for the suggestion of something greater than what the eye could see. In the storm of a Turner sky or the glow of a Constable sunset, one sensed the presence of time itself, the inevitability of change, the fragility and endurance of human life. These artists were not isolated geniuses, but part of a wider cultural current. Their works resonated with the literature of Austen and Byron, Shelley, and Keats, all of whom explored passion, nature, and society's shifting tides. Just as Byron's poetry soared with tempestuous energy, Turner's brush blazed with fire. Just as Austen captured the delicate balance of society, Constable preserved the calm of rural order. The arts of the Regency, across canvas and page, shared a dialogue that revealed a society wrestling with its own identity, simultaneously yearning for stability and intoxicated by change. In galleries and private collections, the paintings of Lawrence, Turner, and Constable became emblems of the era. They immortalized the faces of its leaders, the drama of its landscapes, and the beauty of its fields. They offered both splendor and solace, grandeur and intimacy, spectacle and reflection. Through them, the Regency era spoke not only to its own time, but to the centuries that followed, leaving an artistic legacy as vivid as its fashions and as enduring as its architecture. Thus, in the artistry of Regency painting, one finds the visual soul of the age. Portraits proclaimed authority, landscapes evoked nature's majesty, and romanticism infused every canvas with emotion and meaning. The Regency lives on not just in the stones of Regent Street or the silks of the ballroom, but in the painted skies of Turner, the gentle meadows of Constable, and the noble visages of Lawrence, each a testament to an era that sought beauty even amid uncertainty, and found in art a mirror for its own dazzling contradictions. Among the many voices that emerged during the Regency, none captured the age with greater subtlety and precision than Jane Austen. Writing not from the grand halls of power, but from the quiet parlor of a country home, she chronicled the intricacies of love, family, and society with a pen as sharp as any statesman's speech. Her novels, Sense and Sensibility, 1811, Pride and Prejudice, 1813, and Emma, 1815, did not concern themselves with battles or politics. yet they revealed the heart of Regency England more clearly than any dispatch from Parliament or painting of a king. Austen's genius lay in her ability to transform the drawing rooms and country estates of the gentry into arenas of consequence. To an untrained eye, her stories might seem concerned only with dances, visits, and courtships. Yet beneath the surface, she dissected the structures of class, gender, and inheritance that defined her world. In Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet's wit and independence collide with Mr. Darcy's pride and reserve. But the novel's true subject is broader, the delicate balance between love and status, affection and fortune. The Bennet sisters' futures hang not only on the affections of men, but on the realities of property and wealth. A reminder that marriage, in Regency England, was as much a contract as a romance. In Sense and Sensibility, Austen explored another facet of this social order, the tension between emotion and restraint, between individual desire and societal expectation. Through Eleanor and Mary Ann Dashwood, she showed how women navigated a world in which economic security often depended on marriage, and how love itself was tested by the demands of propriety and inheritance. The contrast between Sense and Sensibility was not merely personal, but emblematic of an age striving to reconcile reason with passion, stability with change. Emma, published in 1815, turned her sharp eye to the perils of privilege and presumption. Emma Woodhouse, clever and wealthy, assumes she can arrange the lives of those around her, only to discover that the heart resists manipulation. In this, Austen revealed the dangers of power wielded carelessly, even within the genteel sphere of matchmaking. Her satire was gentle but penetrating, suggesting that true refinement lay not in control or wealth, but in humility and self-awareness. What makes Austen's work so enduring is the quiet power of her observation. She illuminated the unspoken rules of society, the glances exchanged across a ballroom, the weight of an invitation, the calculation behind a proposal. In her novels, the domestic became political, the personal became universal. She revealed that the Regency was not only an era of grand buildings and fine gowns, but also of subtle negotiations played out in parlors and gardens, where character and virtue mattered as much as fortune and birth. Through Austen's eyes, the Regency comes alive as a world both charming and constrained, filled with possibility, yet bound by rules. Her heroines resist being defined solely by wealth or marriage, even as they recognize the limits imposed upon them. Her prose, precise and ironic, mirrored the elegance of the society she described, yet her themes, love, pride, responsibility, and self-discovery, transcended her age. Thus, Jane Austen gave the Regency its most lasting voice. She held a mirror to her world, reflecting both its grace and its absurdities, and in doing so, she shaped how generations would remember it. Her novels remind us that history is not only written in wars and laws, but in conversations, choices, and the quiet strength of individuals navigating the currents of society. Amid the elegance of Regency drawing rooms and the discipline of its social codes, there rose another voice, urgent, restless, and unrestrained, the voice of the Romantic poets. They were a generation who looked beyond the chandeliers of the ballroom and into the vastness of nature, into the passions of the heart, and into the restless pursuit of freedom. Byron, Shelley, and Keats did not mirror the polished manners of their society. Instead, they challenged, questioned, and dreamed in verse that burned with intensity. Their poetry gave the Regency an emotional depth that contrasted sharply with its outward refinement. Lord Byron embodied the Romantic spirit with both his life and his words. A figure of scandal and admiration, he turned his turbulent emotions into verse that spoke of love, exile, and longing. His Childe Harold's Pilgrimage captured the melancholy of a wanderer searching for meaning, while his lyrical poems expressed the ache of passion and the thrill of rebellion. Byron's voice was not confined to drawing rooms but carried across Europe, inspiring readers with visions of freedom and defiance. He became, in many ways, the archetype of the Romantic hero, restless, flawed, yet irresistible in his pursuit of something greater than convention. Percy Bysshe Shelley, in contrast, was a poet of ideals and visions. Where Byron gave the world his fire, Shelley offered light. His verses celebrated the possibility of human transformation, the hope of a world reshaped by justice and love. In works like Ode to the West Wind, he found in nature both destruction and renewal, seeing the wind not only as a force of storms, but as a symbol of change, sweeping through society. His radical beliefs made him an outsider to many, but his poetry spoke to the universal yearning for liberty, for a future unbound by the heavy chains of tradition. John Keats, the youngest of the three, wrote not of politics or revolution, but of beauty itself. His poetry dwelt on the fleeting nature of life and the permanence of art, capturing the fragility of human existence in lines of exquisite richness. In Ode to a Nightingale, an ode on a Grecian urn, Keats explored how art and nature could preserve truth and beauty against the passage of time. His was a quieter voice, less fiery than Byron's, less prophetic than Shelley's, but perhaps the most tender. He offered the Regency a vision of transcendence, where beauty itself became a form of truth. Together, Byron, Shelley, and Keats revealed the romantic soul of the age. They turned away from the polished restraint of society and gave voice to its undercurrents of longing, rebellion, and wonder. They exalted nature as a mirror of human emotion, celebrated love as both joy and sorrow, and sought freedom in every form, personal, political, spiritual. Their poetry contrasted sharply with the realities of their time: economic unrest, rigid class divisions, and the weight of tradition. Yet in that contrast lay their power. They reminded their readers that beneath the surface of society's elegance pulsed a deeper rhythm, the heartbeat of desire, imagination, and hope. The romantic poets of the Regency did not merely write verses, they offered a vision. Their words carried the promise that life was more than etiquette, more than inheritance, more than the structures of power. In their poetry, the age of Regency found its conscience, its rebellion, and its dream, a lyrical counterpoint to the ordered dances of its ballrooms, a reminder that history is not only lived in rituals and laws, but in the passions that move the human soul. In 1818, a young woman barely 20 years old gave the Regency Era one of its most enduring legacies, a novel that would come to define not only her age, but the centuries that followed. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was unlike anything the polite society of drawing rooms and ballrooms had encountered. It was at once a tale of scientific ambition and a meditation on morality, a story that questioned what it meant to create, to be responsible, and to be human. Emerging from the pen of a woman who had grown up in the orbit of great thinkers and radicals, it stood as both a product of its time and a vision far ahead of it. Mary Shelley was the daughter of two remarkable figures: Mary Wollstonecraft, the pioneering advocate for women's rights, and William Godwin, a philosopher who had challenged the structures of politics and society. From this heritage, she inherited not only intellect but the courage to imagine beyond convention. At just 18, while traveling with her husband Percy, Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron, in Switzerland, she conceived the idea that would become Frankenstein. In the shadow of stormy alpine nights, in a gathering of poets and thinkers, she envisioned a story that married science with myth, invention with consequence. At its heart, Frankenstein is more than a Gothic tale. It reflects the anxieties of an age captivated by discovery. The early 19th century was a time when electricity, chemistry, and anatomy seemed to promise new powers, when boundaries of knowledge were being pushed further than ever before. In Victor Frankenstein, the ambitious scientist who dares to animate life, readers saw both the thrill of progress and the peril of unchecked pursuit. His creation was not merely a monster, it was a mirror of human ambition, of the responsibility that comes with knowledge, and of the moral questions that science must always face. The novel's themes resonated deeply with its Regency audience. This was an era of invention and industrial change, when machines were reshaping work, when voyages of discovery were expanding horizons, and when debates raged over the relationship between reason and faith. Shelley's novel distilled these questions into a narrative both thrilling and profound. It asked whether humanity's reach might exceed its grasp, and whether the pursuit of power without compassion might lead not to triumph, but to tragedy. What made Frankenstein revolutionary was not only its subject, but its authorship. A woman, young and largely unrecognized, had written a work that engaged with the grandest questions of philosophy and science. At a time when women's voices were often confined to novels of manners or domestic reflection, Mary Shelley broke into a territory dominated by men. She proved that imagination could cross the boundaries of gender, and that women, too, could give shape to the deepest dilemmas of the modern world. The impact of Frankenstein has never waned. In its pages lies the seed of what would become modern science fiction, a genre that asks again and again where science might take us and how humanity must respond. But beyond its future legacy, in the Regency it stood as a haunting parable of ambition and consequence. It complemented the romantic poetry of Byron, Shelley, and Keats, but moved beyond their lyricism to confront the ethical dilemmas of discovery itself. Thus, Mary Shelley, through a single novel written in her youth, gave the Regency an imaginative power that rivaled its architecture, fashion, and painting. She showed that art could be prophetic, that fiction could illuminate the responsibilities of knowledge, and that even in an age of glittering surfaces, the deepest questions could not be ignored. In Frankenstein, the Regency found not just a story of horror, but a mirror for its own hopes and fears, a reminder that progress must always walk hand in hand with conscience. Even as the Regency dazzled with elegance in its drawing rooms and refinement in its ballrooms, another force was reshaping England with relentless energy: the Industrial Revolution. It was the quiet thunder beneath the age's grace, a transformation powered not by music or manners, but by iron, coal, and steam. The Regency years were not yet the height of industrialization, but the signs were everywhere. The hiss of steam engines, the clatter of looms in textile mills, the blackened chimneys of expanding towns. In this world of invention, the nation was moving toward a future far different from the one its ancestors had known. The steam engine, perfected by James Watt in the late 18th century, had by the Regency become a symbol of unstoppable progress. Once harnessed to pumps and factories, it transformed production itself. Textile mills in Manchester, Leeds, and beyond turned raw cotton into cloth at speeds unimaginable to earlier generations. Machines whirred where once hands had labored, and the scale of output grew vast. A single mill could employ hundreds, its power drawn from the engine's steady rhythm, its profits tied to Britain's global reach in trade. Cotton from India and the Americas flowed in, and the mills of the North turned it into cloth for markets that stretched across the empire. Alongside these mills, the first sparks of a new transport age began to glow. Early railways, still small and experimental, hinted at the transformations to come. Horse-drawn wagons ran on iron rails, carrying coal more efficiently than ever before. Engineers were already imagining engines that could pull passengers as well as freight, shrinking distance and altering the geography of trade and travel. The Regency did not yet see the great rail boom, but it saw its dawn, a promise that the future would be one of speed, connection, and mobility. Yet progress carried shadows. The growing towns of the North and Midlands filled with smoke, their air heavy with soot from chimneys that rarely slept. Rivers darkened with waste, streets crowded with workers drawn from countryside to city. The contrast between the polished elegance of Mayfair and the crowded districts of industrial towns was striking. In London, fashionable carriages rolled down Regent Street. In Manchester, rows of modest houses stood in the shadow of tall mills. Wealth and poverty, refinement and hardship existed side by side, divided by the same forces of invention that propelled Britain forward. This disparity was more than visual. It was the defining tension of the age. The owners of factories and mills amassed fortunes, their names added to the rolls of the wealthy. The working poor, by contrast, endured long hours and uncertain wages, their lives governed by the pace of machines. The rhythm of the steam engine replaced the rhythm of the seasons, and the promise of prosperity seemed unevenly distributed. For every fortune built in cotton or coal, there were countless lives lived in narrow streets, where survival was measured day by day. And yet, the Industrial Revolution was not only hardship, it was also possibility. It created new forms of work, new opportunities for invention, and a sense that England was standing at the threshold of a new age. To many, the sight of engines and factories symbolized strength, a sign that the nation was becoming the workshop of the world. Even those who feared the consequences could not deny the momentum. The hiss of steam, the clang of iron, the steady beat of progress were sounds that could not be silenced. Thus, within the Regency's dual character, its elegance and its unease, the breath of the Industrial Revolution was unmistakable. It was a force that promised power and prosperity while revealing division and disquiet. To walk the streets of Manchester or Leeds was to sense the pulse of modernity, just as surely as a stroll through Regent's Park displayed the refinement of tradition. The Regency was not only a time of ballrooms and literature, but also the cradle of machines, a moment when steam and steel began to write themselves into the story of England. Under the calm surface of Regency elegance, Britain's global economy was expanding with a power that reached far beyond its shores. By the time Napoleon had been defeated, Britain ruled the seas with unmatched authority. Naval victories secured trade routes, and merchant fleets carried goods across oceans in a steady flow that connected London with the farthest harbors of the world. The Regency era, so often remembered for its fashion and refinement, was also an age of commerce, when Britain's prosperity was bound to a network of exchange stretching from the Caribbean to China, from India to the Mediterranean. India stood at the heart of this system. Through the East India Company, Britain's presence grew ever more influential, shaping both trade and governance. Cotton, spices, indigo, and tea traveled westward, filling the warehouses and markets of England. In return, British textiles and manufactured goods made their way east, weaving the subcontinent more tightly into the threads of imperial commerce. The Regency household reflected these connections in daily life. A shawl from Kashmir draped over a lady's gown, a ledger tracking profits from Indian imports, or a steaming cup of tea poured at a fashionable gathering. To the east, China provided another vital link in the chain. Tea, porcelain, and silk flowed in great quantities to Britain, where they became symbols of refinement and taste. The London tea table and the carefully set dining room depended on goods shipped across vast distances. While economic imbalances between the two nations simmered beneath the surface, the Regency world experienced China largely through its exports, a cultural and material exchange that brought distant craftsmanship into the heart of English homes. The Caribbean and the Americas supplied sugar, coffee, tobacco, and other commodities that filled both parlors and markets. These goods shaped the tastes and habits of Regency society, transforming the daily rituals of dining and leisure. Coffeehouses in London buzzed with conversation fueled by imports, and the sweet taste of sugar became a staple of both the wealthy and the aspiring middle classes. Behind every fashionable treat lay the immense machinery of global trade, its routes crisscrossing oceans and tying Britain's prosperity ever more firmly to international commerce. Closer to home, the ports of Liverpool, Bristol, and London pulsed with activity. Ships crowded their docks, warehouses brimmed with goods, and merchants calculated profits with eager precision. These centers of exchange were more than commercial hubs. They were engines of cultural contact, where sailors, traders, and travelers carried news and influence from distant lands. From these ports, wealth flowed inward, sustaining not only the grandeur of the capital, but also the growing industries of the Midlands and the North. Canals and the first experimental railways carried imported materials deep into the country, linking rural landscapes with global markets. The prosperity generated by this commerce reshaped British society. Merchants who had built fortunes on overseas trade joined the ranks of the wealthy, investing in estates and competing with long-established gentry for influence and status. The economy no longer rested solely on agriculture or landed wealth, but increasingly on trade, manufacturing, and global reach. The Regency elite displayed their cosmopolitan tastes in art, furnishings, and dress, all of which bore marks of distant lands. In this sense, the Regency was not only a national era, but an international one, deeply entwined with the flows of goods and ideas across seas. Yet the very scale of this prosperity carried contradictions. While goods became more abundant, not all could share equally in the wealth. The profits of trade accumulated unevenly, enriching some while leaving others only glimpsing luxury from afar. Still, the energy of global commerce gave Britain a confidence and ambition that set the stage for the Victorian century to come. In every cargo unloaded on the docks, in every cup of tea poured in a drawing room, the Regency announced itself as an age where the horizons of England had widened to embrace the world. Thus, beneath the Regency's polished image of grace and society, the true power of the age was its commerce. It was the empire of trade that bound distant continents to English life, the steady rhythm of ships and markets that underpinned the elegance of ballrooms and the grandeur of architecture. The Regency was not only a stylish chapter in English history, it was also a global one, written in goods, in exchange, and in the ceaseless movement of ships across the seas. Amidst the glitter of Regency society and the hum of its commerce, another quieter revolution was unfolding, one of science and knowledge. This was an age when curiosity itself seemed to quicken, when men and women turned their gaze to the mysteries of nature, determined to measure, experiment, and understand. The Regency may be remembered for its ballrooms and fashions, but in the lecture halls, laboratories, and observatories of the age, ideas were forming that would shape the modern world. Among the leading figures of this scientific spirit was Humphrey Davy, a chemist whose discoveries captured both scholarly attention and public imagination. Born without wealth or title, Davy rose through brilliance and experiment, dazzling audiences with lectures that combined spectacle and learning. At the Royal Institution in London, he demonstrated the powers of chemistry to crowded rooms, setting off reactions that glowed, crackled, and sparked. To Regency society, he was not merely a scientist, but a kind of magician of the elements, revealing hidden forces that seemed at once wondrous and practical. Davy's contributions were more than theatrical. He isolated elements such as sodium, potassium, and magnesium, expanding the very alphabet of matter. His experiments with gases, including nitrous oxide, opened new questions about physiology and consciousness. Most famously, his invention of the safety lamp for miners saved countless lives in coal pits, proving that science could serve not only curiosity, but also human welfare. In him, the Regency witnessed the fusion of intellectual daring with practical benefit, a symbol of how knowledge might be harnessed for the good of society. Beyond chemistry, the heavens themselves became a stage for Regency exploration. Astronomy advanced with improved telescopes, allowing observers to chart the stars with greater accuracy and to speculate on the vastness of the universe. Discoveries of new celestial bodies, refinements in navigation, and debates about the nature of the solar system stirred both scholars and laypeople. The night sky, once the domain of poets and dreamers, was now measured and mapped with instruments that brought distant worlds a little closer. In a society entranced by both romance and reason, the stars became a place where imagination and precision met. Medicine, too, was evolving. Advances in anatomy and physiology laid the groundwork for more systematic approaches to health and disease. Vaccination against smallpox, pioneered in the late 18th century by Edward Jenner, spread further during the Regency, offering a measure of protection against one of the age's most feared illnesses. Hospitals and medical schools grew in prominence, and the public began to see medicine less as a mystery and more as a profession, shaped by study and experiment. The Regency was not free from illness, but it was increasingly armed with knowledge to confront it. The culture of science in this period was also shaped by its accessibility. Lectures at the Royal Institution were attended not only by scholars, but by fashionable society. Men and women of means treated science as part of their cultural life, alongside music, art, and literature. The experiments of Davy, or the demonstrations of new machines, were spectacles as eagerly anticipated as plays at the theater. Knowledge was no longer confined to cloistered academies. It was becoming part of the social conversation, a marker of refinement and engagement with the modern world. This blending of curiosity and culture revealed the spirit of the Regency. It was an age that loved display, but also valued discovery, that relished elegance, but also sought explanation. Science was not yet professionalized in the way it would be in later centuries, but it was vibrant, open, and imaginative. It reflected the very character of the age, bold, experimental, and always balancing between wonder and reason. Thus, within the Regency, one finds not only tales of fashion, empire, and society, but also the beginnings of a new relationship between humanity and knowledge. The sparks of Davy's experiments, the steady gaze of astronomers, and the careful hands of physicians all testified to a world awakening to possibility. The Regency was not merely a stylish chapter in history, it was also a chapter of inquiry, when the pursuit of truth became as captivating as any dance or debate, and when science began to claim its place in the story of modern England. The Regency was an age of spectacle, brilliant, elegant, but also burdened by excess. If the era dazzled with its architecture, literature, and scientific discovery, it also revealed an appetite for luxury that often overstepped the limits of prudence. At the heart of this duality stood the Prince Regent himself, a man whose taste for grandeur shaped the look of the age while straining both his fortune and his reputation. His residences became emblems of magnificence. Carlton House in London was transformed into a palace of glittering interiors, where gilded mirrors reflected the glow of chandeliers and imported furnishings signaled a cosmopolitan taste. The Royal Pavilion at Brighton, designed with domes and richly decorated interiors, stood as an even more dramatic expression of his love for display. To some, these structures were triumphs of artistic ambition. To others, they were symbols of a ruler more concerned with personal indulgence than the hardships endured by his people during years of war and high taxation. Entertainment, too, carried the same air of lavish performance. Balls stretched long into the night, accompanied by orchestras and elaborate feasts. Guests arrived in the latest attire, silks, satins, and velvets chosen to impress under the glow of thousands of candles. These evenings were carefully choreographed. More than mere diversions, they reinforced the ideals of refinement, elegance, and hierarchy. A Regency ball was as much a stage as any theater where society displayed its grace and ambition through dance, music, and fashion. Yet the cost of sustaining such brilliance was immense. The Prince Regent's personal spending spiraled, his debts rising to extraordinary levels. Art collections, luxurious clothing, carriages, and constant renovations consumed vast sums, leading to repeated requests for financial assistance from Parliament. For ordinary citizens facing economic pressure, these expenditures seemed a glaring sign of disconnect between ruler and subject. Caricaturists seized on this, lampooning the regent as a man absorbed in display, while critics in pamphlets and newspapers questioned the wisdom of such extravagance in difficult times. Around him, a courtly circle embraced similar pursuits of luxury and leisure. Fine dining, seaside retreats, and social gatherings became the rhythm of life for those who moved in fashionable society. These entertainments, glittering with charm, nevertheless deepened the impression of a world detached from the daily realities of the nation at large. Observers remarked on the striking contrast between the resplendent banquets of the elite and the modest meals of working families, a reminder of the sharp inequalities that marked the era. Still, this age of indulgence was not without meaning. It reflected a society caught between tradition and transformation, seeking comfort in grandeur while facing the uncertainty of change. The Prince Regent's architectural projects and entertainments were not only displays of personal taste, but also assertions of cultural prestige, an attempt to place Britain at the center of European style and sophistication. They were both expressions of ambition and veils of distraction, concealing unease with dazzling surfaces. In the end, the story of Regency extravagance is inseparable from the story of the age itself. It illustrates how elegance could shade into excess, how refinement could border on waste. The chandeliers of Carlton House, the domes of Brighton Pavilion, and the endless cycle of feasts and entertainments all speak to a chapter of history that glittered brilliantly, even as it strained under its own weight. It was an age of brilliance and anxiety, a moment when display defined power, and when the pursuit of style left behind a legacy as memorable as it was contested. Beneath the glittering surface of the Regency age, with its palaces, ballrooms, and promenades, lay another reality, one far less adorned, marked by hardship and discontent. While the elite danced under chandeliers, many lived in precarious conditions, their lives defined not by luxury but by struggle. This tension gave the Regency its sharpest contrasts, an era celebrated for elegance, yet shadowed by deprivation and unrest. In the growing cities of Britain, the problem of debt weighed heavily. Those who could not pay their obligations often found themselves confined to debtors' prisons, grim institutions where lives were stalled by misfortune. Within their walls, men and women were kept until debts could somehow be repaid. A paradox, for imprisonment rarely offered the means to resolve one's plight. Such prisons became symbols of a society where financial failure was treated as a personal failing, and where the poor were punished for their poverty. Writers and reformers of the time noted the cruelty of such a system, contrasting it with the splendor of a nation that prided itself on refinement and order. Beyond the cities, in the coal fields and mining districts, life bore a different kind of severity. Coal was the fuel of the Regency, powering steam engines, heating homes, and driving the growth of industry. But the work of extracting it was arduous and dangerous. The mines were dark and confined, the air heavy, the hours long. For families who depended on this labor, survival demanded endurance, and communities grew around the pits in conditions that outsiders often found stark and unsettling. Reports from travelers and reformers painted vivid portraits of towns where chimneys smoked day and night, and where the prosperity of the nation was bought at the price of unrelenting toil in the depths of the earth. Such conditions fostered discontent. The end of the Napoleonic Wars had brought victory, but also unemployment, as returning soldiers found few opportunities and wages remained unstable. At the same time, laws like the Corn Laws of 1815 kept the price of bread high, pressing hardest on those with the least to spend. Public gatherings and protests began to rise, fueled by the belief that the system favored the wealthy while neglecting the needs of the poor. The harsh response to such unrest, most tragically at the gathering in St. Peter's Field in Manchester in 1819, revealed how fragile the balance between order and grievance had become. Literature and commentary of the era did not ignore these struggles. Satirists and pamphleteers depicted the stark contrast between the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the streets of industrial towns. Social critics pointed to the debtors' prisons as evidence of injustice, while reformers spoke out against conditions in mining districts. The very tension between luxury and hardship became a theme in public life, echoing in newspapers, speeches, and private conversations. The Regency was increasingly aware of its own contradictions, a society devoted to elegance, yet haunted by the visible presence of poverty. This duality gave the Regency its distinctive character. It was not a simple age of refinement, nor only an age of unrest, but both together, two faces of one coin. The glitter of Brighton Pavilion and the gloom of the debtor's cell belong to the same story, inseparable parts of a society in transition. The richness of the age's culture cannot be understood without acknowledging the struggles that coexisted alongside it. In this way, the Regency becomes more than an era of style. It becomes a lesson in contrast. It shows how societies may flourish in art and architecture while faltering in justice and equality, how refinement may coexist with resentment, and how beneath the music of the ballroom lies the murmur of discontent. These voices, though often subdued, were part of the fabric of the age, and they foreshadowed the demands for reform that would define the decades to come. In January 1820, the death of George III brought the Regency era to its formal end. The Prince Regent, long the central figure of the age, now ascended the throne as King George IV. For nearly a decade, he had ruled in his father's stead, shaping the style and tone of society, and with his coronation, the period that bore his title officially closed. Yet the influence of those years did not fade. The Regency had left an imprint too vivid, too characteristic, to be erased by the mere turning of a page in history. The new king entered his reign with all the trappings of grandeur. His coronation was staged with unrivaled spectacle, a reflection of his lifelong devotion to display. It seemed in many ways the culmination of the tastes and tendencies that had defined him as regent. A love of magnificence, a determination to project authority through architecture, ceremony, and art. If the Regency had often been criticized for extravagance, it was also admired for elegance, and George IV carried both legacies into his kingship. But more than a man, the Regency itself had shaped England. The years of his regency coincided with victory over Napoleon, the expansion of global commerce, the flowering of romantic literature, and the transformation of cities and industry. It was a short chapter, yet it felt like an age of its own, defined not only by politics, but by culture, not only by power, but by style. The domes of Brighton Pavilion, the novels of Austen, the poetry of Byron and Keats, the paintings of Lawrence and Turner, all spoke of a society alive with creativity, contradiction, and confidence. Even as critics pointed to debts, inequalities, and unrest, the Regency remained a reference point, a lens through which later generations would measure taste, fashion, and refinement. Its mixture of brilliance and unease gave it a character at once alluring and complex. The coronation of George IV did not erase those qualities. It sealed them. From that moment onward, the Regency was remembered not as a transitional interval, but as a distinctive era in its own right. Thus, when the bells rang to mark the new reign, they also tolled for the close of one of England's most stylish chapters. The Regency had ended, but its legacy endured. In the streets of London redesigned by John Nash, in the novels read across drawing rooms, in the very sense of elegance that the age had sought so passionately to cultivate. To speak of Regency England would always be to speak of a time when grandeur and anxiety, refinement and unrest intertwined to create a period unlike any other. The close of the Regency did not end its story. Rather, it ensured that the age would live on through its cultural legacies, those enduring creations that defined both the elegance and the imagination of the period. While George IV's reign would continue into the 1830s, the essence of the Regency remained most alive in the works of its writers, artists, and architects, whose achievements became woven into the fabric of national identity. Jane Austen, whose novels were modestly received in her lifetime, came to embody the social world of the Regency more than any chronicler of politics or diplomacy. Her depictions of family life, courtship, and class have since become the lens through which generations view the age. Elizabeth Bennet's wit, Emma Woodhouse's self-assurance, the Dashwood sisters' dilemmas all stand as portraits of Regency society, nuanced and timeless. In her novels, the drawing rooms and country estates of the early 19th century became arenas where character and morality were tested, and where the delicate balance of love, status, and fortune played out with quiet but profound drama. Today, Austen is not only a novelist but a cultural symbol of England itself, her words shaping the imagination of millions who seek to glimpse the Regency through her eyes. Byron, meanwhile, cast the Regency onto the world stage through poetry that was at once personal and universal. His voice, restless and passionate, gave rise to the archetype of the romantic hero, a figure as much admired for his flaws as for his brilliance. His Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and later works carried the spirit of the age across Europe, making him one of the most celebrated poets of his time. Alongside Shelley and Keats, he transformed the Regency into an age not only of elegance, but of deep feeling, of longing, and of the imaginative rebellion against restraint. The resonance of these poets extended far beyond the borders of Britain, yet they remained indelibly tied to the atmosphere of the Regency, giving it a lyricism that outlasted its politics. The architectural legacy of the period is equally vivid. Walk through London, Bath, or Brighton, and the Regency is still visible in stone and stucco. John Nash's sweeping Regent Street and the elegant crescents of Bath reveal a style that married classical inspiration with modern urban vision. The Brighton Pavilion, exotic and theatrical, remains one of the boldest statements of architectural imagination in British history. These buildings were not only monuments of their day, but symbols of a society intent on expressing itself through grandeur and design. 2 centuries later, they continue to shape the landscapes of their cities, their curves and columns reminding us of an age that prized display as much as function. Even in smaller details, the rounded doorways, the wrought iron balconies, the carefully planned terraces, Regency architecture left its mark. It created neighborhoods that still carry its character, blending symmetry with grace, and serving as a daily reminder of how style can define a society. For residents and visitors alike, these streets are a living museum, testifying to a time when architecture was both aspiration and identity. Thus, the cultural legacy of the Regency remains inseparable from England's own sense of itself. In literature, it gave voices that continue to speak across centuries. In poetry, it offered visions of passion and freedom. In architecture, it left monuments that endure in stone. Though the political regency ended with George IV's accession, the cultural regency never truly closed. It lingers in novels read and reread, in poems recited, in streets and squares still walked today. To speak of the Regency now is to speak not only of a chapter in history, but of an inheritance that still breathes in England's culture. It is the elegance of Austen's prose, the fervor of Byron's verse, the enduring grace of Nash's designs. It is a legacy that outlasted its moment, carrying forward the stylish spirit of an age that has never ceased to captivate the imagination. In the centuries since its passing, the Regency has lived on not only in history books, but in memory and imagination. Few eras of English life have been so carefully preserved in the public consciousness, reimagined in novels, films, and television dramas. For later generations, the Regency became more than a span of years between 1811 and 1820. It became a symbol, a shorthand for elegance, wit, and romance, tinged with the contradictions that defined it. The novels of Jane Austen, once modest works read in small circles, blossomed into global classics that anchored the image of the period. Her drawing rooms, her walks along country lanes, her subtle dissections of character and class have become the way millions picture the Regency. Modern adaptations, whether faithful or inventive, have taken those stories and broadcast them to a worldwide audience, embedding the era in popular imagination. Elizabeth Bennet's sharp remarks, Darcy's reserved pride, Emma's misjudgments, all are now icons, their worlds synonymous with refined wit and emotional restraint. Through Austen, the Regency endures as the quintessential setting for stories of love, society, and self-discovery. So too with Byron and the Romantic poets. Their restless passion and defiance of convention continue to speak across the ages. The Byronic hero has become a figure of legend, inspiring countless characters in literature, theater, and film. When later readers or viewers encounter tales of brooding figures wandering in search of meaning, they are witnessing echoes of the Regency's poetic legacy. The age's lyricism, born in salons and published in slim volumes, has resonated far beyond its time, shaping cultural archetypes that remain powerful even today. The architectural face of the Regency has also stood the test of time. Visitors to London stroll along Regent Street, gaze at the terraces of Bath, or marvel at the exotic extravagance of Brighton Pavilion, and they encounter more than stone and stucco. They encounter the vision of a society determined to express itself through elegance. These spaces are not only preserved as heritage, but lived in, inhabited, and admired, proof that the aesthetic ideals of the Regency remain relevant. The clean lines, the balanced proportions, the theatrical flourishes, all stand as reminders of a moment when style became identity and identity became legacy. Even in popular culture, the Regency has acquired a mythic aura. The grand balls, the empire waist gowns, the clipped remarks over tea have become fixtures of period drama. Whether on stage, in novels, or on screens large and small, the era returns again and again, its charm undimmed. To audiences abroad, it often represents England itself. Graceful, disciplined, witty, and complex, the Regency thus transcended its time to become an international cultural export, a chapter of history reborn endlessly in imagination. Yet beneath the charm, the contradictions of the age are never far away. Historians remind us of the unrest, the debt, the inequities, and the anxieties that shadowed the splendor. This complexity is part of what gives the Regency its enduring appeal. It was never a perfect golden age, but rather a moment of transition, an interlude between the rational order of the 18th century and the industrial might of the Victorian era. In its blend of brilliance and tension, refinement and unease, the Regency remains recognizably human, an age of style and substance bound together in fragile harmony. And so, In conclusion, the Regency era endures not simply as a date on the calendar, but as a stylish chapter in the story of England. It was an age of victories abroad and unrest at home, of literature that dissected manners and poetry, that embraced passion, of palaces that glittered while prisons loomed in shadow. It gave the world Austen and Byron, Nash's terraces, and Turner's skies. It gave England an identity both national and global, refined yet restless. To walk the streets of Bath, to read the words of Austen, to stand beneath the domes of Brighton Pavilion is to touch the spirit of the Regency still. It was short in years, lasting scarcely a decade, but vast in influence. Its elegance lingers, its contradictions intrigue, and its legacy continues to shape how England remembers itself. The Regency era remains, as it was in life and as it is in memory, a chapter of brilliance, stylish, complex, and unforgettable.